Good morning. It's very nice to be here. Although I've never been to Maze before, I'm quite used to the area. I'm a frequent visitor to Magabry, so I know the roads and I know the local area, but never quite made it to Maze before. So it was really nice to see this part of the countryside this morning. What I want to do this morning is tell you about the work of Thompson House, which is a hostel for men who are leaving prison. It's managed by the Council of Social Witness, and the Council of Social Witness receives money through United Appeal. So to start off by giving you the bit of the boring part, just tell you a bit about the history and then go into the day-to-day work of what we do. So we are a hostel in the criminal justice system, and we accommodate 19 men. And these are men who are being released from prison on licence. They can be on bail, or they can be on what's called home leave, where they're nearing the end of the sentence and they get a couple of days out a week to acclimatise themselves to life on the outside. We can work with people who've been in prison for up to 20 years, so they're not used to the traffic on the road, they're just not used to day-to-day things. So they need to do that in the last months leading up to their release. We only take medium to high-risk offenders, and that's because they need to be monitored to make sure that it is safe for them to move back out into the community. So we're able to have curfews. They have to be in by certain times during the day. At night, we will monitor them. We'll monitor their behaviour, see if they present under the influence of drink or drugs. And we'll feed all of that back to probation, and that will help with the assessment of are they safe to move back into the community. So Thompson House is named after the Reverend W.J. Thompson, and he was a minister in Belfast. And in the 1940s, he noticed a lot of young lads were coming into Belfast from the country areas, and they were coming to look for work. They thought that the streets of Belfast were paved with gold. They would come, they'd make the fortune, and come home in glory. Unfortunately, when they landed, they had no home and they had no work. So he would minister to them and he would pray to them. But he quickly realised that he was going home to a privileged manse and they were still on the streets. So initially he would invite some home, give them a warm bed for the night, a meal, and then he would get them accommodation the next day. But he realised he couldn't solve the problem on his own. So he approached the General Assembly and they agreed that the Boys Residential Club could be set up. And they formed a committee and they carried on in that work, trying to find people accommodation, work, apprenticeships, so that they could get back into society. And that work continued. The Reverend Thompson died in 1963 and the committee carried on with his work. But in the 1970s, when the Troubles started, it's in what we would now call an interface area. And the two communities were clashing and the project just couldn't keep going. So they had to sell the property, sell the furniture, and the money sat in a bank account, the Boys Residential Club. In 1978, the prison chaplains noticed a lot of young lads were coming into a lot of young lads were leaving the young offender centre, and when they left, they had nowhere to live. They were in danger of being homeless, and that would increase their risk of reoffending. They either couldn't go home because the paramilitaries wouldn't let them, or they couldn't go home because the families were ashamed. They brought shame on the family and they wouldn't have them home. Or they'd been in the care system and they had no home to go to. So they agreed that they would buy a property and that would be a home for ex-prisoners. And that opened in 1984, and in honour of Reverend Thompson, it was named after him. So we're officially called W.J. Thompson House. The main aims of the hostels are to provide suitable accommodation for male offenders, to help residents find and retain employment. And research will prove if you can get somebody stable accommodation and a job, they are much less likely to reoffend. We also try to encourage our residents to go into education. And again, research proves that 66% of prisoners are only educated to Key Stage 2. Which is about P7. So their literacy, their numeracy is very basic. So they're only really going to get jobs that would help them get minimum wage. And that's difficult for the residents if they're working hard and feel they're not getting rewarded. So we encourage them to go into education as well. We want to help residents to establish their own homes because they probably can't go back to their families. But as a project of PCI and of the Council of Social Witness, we want to commend the Christian faith and way of life in an open and accepting manner. That's our most important aim, and that's what we try to do on a day-to-day basis. So the average day in Thompson House starts at 9 o'clock, and that's when we wake all the residents up. And there's two reasons for that. One, we want to get them into a good routine. Quite often they have been used to partying all night, staying up, drinking up till 4 o'clock in the morning, crashing in bed and not getting up till the afternoon and doing the same thing. So it's a bad routine. We want to get them into a good routine. But since the ceasefires, we've had to have a 9 o'clock morning wake up because drugs are very big now in Northern Ireland. It's one of the biggest problems. Probation would say that 77% of their clients are on probation either because they've offended under the influence of drugs, they've offended to get more money for drugs, or they're trading in drugs. So drugs is one of our major problems, and we closed the project in 2011 and refurbished it and opened in 2012. And since then, we've had 6 deaths, 4 heroin overdoses and 2 deaths by suicide. And in the suicides, there was evidence of drugs taking. So if we're going to find somebody dead, it's going to be at 9 o'clock in the morning. And that's very difficult for staff. So we try to do that, but also we do 4 other room checks during the day just to keep an eye on the residents, to make sure they are safe and to make sure that if they're using heroin, that we can keep an eye on them. So that is the big part of our work now. Now, I'm sure if you've been listening attentively, you will have picked up by now that I have an English accent. And I'm not going to apologise for that. But I am the best kind of Englishman. I'm a Yorkshireman. So when I first moved over here in 1990, I've lived here 30 years, I have to say I immediately envied Ulster men. Because I have this great system where the women do all the housework, washing, ironing. And the men sit and watch them. It's a great system, absolutely great system. But that means that we reap the benefits of that in Thompson House. When our residents come, they have very few skills. So we have to teach them the basic skills, because when they move out, they will have to move out and live on their own. So it was one night I was on duty, and a resident came to me and asked if I would boil 2 eggs for his supper. And I told him he was big enough and ugly enough to do that himself. He was 18 years old, and I left him to it. Went back to the kitchen a few minutes later, and there on the stove was a pan with 2 eggs and no water. So I said to him, doesn't boiling an egg imply water? And he said, my mummy always did that for me, I don't know how to do it. So we take nothing for granted. We will teach him how to boil eggs if need be, how to make beans on toast, chili con carne, stew, spaghetti bolognese, quick, simple, easy, cheap meals. Because in reality, they will have to do that when they move out. So we teach them all of those skills as well. I particularly enjoy cooking. So I enjoy Indian cooking, so I brought that into Thompson House. I bring all the spices in and teach them how to do that. And try to get the residents to choose which recipe they would like. And I obviously work with big macho men from prison, and presented my cookbook and said, what would you like? And the resident said, I've never had an Indian before, but I'd like that one. I said, right, that's a chicken vindaloo. That's the hottest one I know to make. Choose something else, please. He said, no, I've heard of a chicken vindaloo, I want that. So I made it. Now, it's to teach them that the meat changes colour, how to fry onions and all of that. Did the vindaloo, left him to it to eat, went back in the kitchen, he had his mouth under the tap, and his other friend was trying to splash water in. So we try not to do things too hot, but we're just trying to teach them how to do the basics in cooking, because that's what they will have to do when they move out. So that's the kind of work we do with the residents, trying to prepare them to move back into society. Each resident is given a key worker when they come to Thompson House, and that'll either be a social worker if they're a complex case, or a project worker. And we will try to work with them to address any issues they have around offending behaviour. And obviously drugs is the major issue, but alcohol hasn't gone away. And usually if there's drugs, there's alcohol and vice versa. So we look at that. Anger management is one of the big issues for our residents. They, again, macho men, they don't want to back down. They get themselves into situations they can't handle, and they come out fighting, and quite often use weapons. So we're trying to work with them to address those kind of issues in the hope that they will not reoffend. And then we also find that our residents, in the background that they've grown up with, they've got obviously big anger management problems, low self-esteem, and quite often we can discover abuse in their background as well. So that's what they're trying to deal with, and that's what they use the alcohol and drugs to mask. So what I'd like to do is just tell you about two of our residents, to give you an idea of the background of them, how they ended up in Thompson House. It is not to excuse their behaviour, because if you've been a victim of crime or you know somebody who has, it can be traumatic. But it's just to show you that quite often our residents have also been victims, and that's what's led to them coming to Thompson House. So there's one resident we worked with who came to us in his 20s. He had grown up in a two-parent home, which is actually quite rare for us. Most of our residents come from single families. But when he was 11, he was abused by one of his local neighbours, and that spiralled his behaviour out of control. He was just at the point where he's taken his 11 plus, and unfortunately couldn't concentrate on that. All his cousins had passed it, he was expected to pass it. So when he failed, understandably, his family were not happy, and he had to cope with that. He went to the local secondary school and was struggling. By the age of 13, he was drinking alcohol very heavily, and he was bringing bad behaviour into school and was quite often excluded. By the age of 16, he was on drugs, and all of this was to try and help him to deal with the abuse. He just was struggling, so alcohol and drugs are what he turned to. He got into a relationship and very quickly got the girl pregnant, and they got married. But the alcohol and the drugs were taking over his life big time. The marriage failed, he had to move out. And he then really spiraled into drinking drugs. One night, him and a friend were in a pub. They were drinking heavily, and a street drinker attached himself to them, went back to party, and unfortunately ended up dead. Our resident was charged with manslaughter and ended up first of all in Magabry and then in McGilligan. Got 10 years in prison. Served 5 years in prison, 5 years on licence, and came to Thompson House. He was doing quite well, but after 3 months, he relapsed back onto the drink and drugs. So we worked with him closely. We got him into rehab. The Council Social Witness has Carlisle House, which has a 6-week programme, a rehabilitation programme for people on drink and drugs. He went through that, came back to us, and did quite well. Went to another project Carlisle House have called Grace Court, which is supported flats. Went back on the drink and drugs and had to come back to Thompson House. And he was struggling. He started gambling and was getting into other addictions. So he came back to us, and my church, Maze Presbyterian Church, was having an alpha course, and I invited him to that, and he came along. But as I said, his education kind of stalled at about 13 when he really hit the drink badly. So his educational attainment wasn't too high. He said to me that he couldn't really cope with alpha. It was aimed too high. People were asking difficult questions. He didn't even understand the questions, never mind the answers. So he said he wouldn't be able to come back to it. But he said something back to me as we were driving back to Thompson House, which did encourage me. I've never had it said to me before. And he doesn't even know the Bible, never mind the Book of Ruth. On the way back to Thompson House, he said to me, "I'm sorry I can't go back to that. I don't want to let you down. But I do believe one day your God will be my God." And that was just so encouraging to me. So that's what I held on to. He left Thompson House, and intermittently he would have drink and he would have drugs. But he stayed in touch with us. And then a few years back, he started coming to Glengormley Presbyterian again. Because of the drink and the drugs, he was a bit paranoid, couldn't cope with the morning service, but could cope with the smaller evening service. And so he started coming to that. And because of me and my work, Glengormley know what I do, and with the see somebody strange with a lot of tattoos, they automatically presume where they're from, and they get alongside them and they support them. And they were so good and so kind to him, give him furniture, give him clothes, and really supported him, and he loved coming along. But unfortunately, he relapsed back into the drink and drugs, and he died a couple of Easters ago from a heroin overdose. It was really sad and really tragic, but I have held on to the belief that he did make a commitment. He told me in the month leading up to his death that he had come to faith, but was still struggling because of the abuse and because of the drugs he was on. So unfortunately, that was one of the issues. He also, because of, again, the abuse and the drink and drugs, had mental health issues. And 2 years before he died, he was finally diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, which is a particularly dreadful mental illness. You have schizophrenia, but you also have bipolar. So not only are you up and down with your moods, you've also got voices, you're paranoid. So he'd been struggling with that for many, many years. And because he'd been taking drugs, it had been masked. It had never been picked up. So he did get a bit more peace in his later years. Another resident we had came to us. As a child, he'd been brought up in a home where his mum kept getting into abusive relationships. So then she would have to flee to Women's Aid for refuge, and that kept happening. When he was 14 years old, he was too old to go into a women's refuge, so he had to go into a children's home, and his siblings and his mum stayed in the women's refuge. He struggled with that. He felt rejected. He blamed his mum for it, got in with the wrong crowd, started offending, and then started taking drink and drugs. He was more taking non-prescribed medication. So he would abuse Lyrica, which is also called pregabalin, tramadol, and diazepam. And if they're abusing meds, that'll be the ones that they abuse. So he then had to offend to get money for that. We tried to work with him, started working with him when he was 18 up till he was 23. But as he needed money for drugs, what he would do was choose a vulnerable resident, quite often an elderly one, force his way into the room, steal money and belongings from them and sell them to get more drugs. So unfortunately, we didn't feel that we could work with him. But he still comes back from time to time for support. He feels that he gets a lot of support in Thompson House. One of the interesting things is that we work with 6 other hostels. There's 7 of us in the criminal justice system, and we are the most evangelical Christian one. The others are secular. One is Salvation Army. They have a Christian ethos, but we're the most evangelical Christian one. Every Tuesday morning, I have to meet with other hostel managers, and we decide who's going to which hostel. And about 50% of the cases say, I'll only go to Thompson House. And we find that encouraging because it's a Christian hostel and they know we are, and they either have been with us before and want to come back, or they go to prison and they tell their friends only go to Thompson House. And so that's really nice that the Presbyterian Church has that kind of witness. Before Christmas, I'd got a phone call saying there's a resident who'd come to us on home leave. He'd been coming for 2 days a month, and he was now being released. He was coming to Thompson House, and I said, I'm sorry, I have no vacancies. He can't come to us. He refused to leave prison. He was getting his license, and he hung on for 2 weeks. I'm not going, let's go to Thompson House. I didn't have a bed at 2 weeks. I just had to kick him out and send him to another hostel. So we just think it's encouraging that they want to come to a Christian hostel, so we get the opportunity to work alongside them. So those are our residents, the ones who suffered abuse, who suffered neglect, that got involved in illegal activities. And when you hear the background, it's not surprising to do that. But it's against that background that we try to share the love of Christ. And it's a great privilege. The majority of our residents have no Christian background whatsoever. 3rd, 4th generation unchurched. The majority will have nobody in their living memory, in their family, who was a Christian or even went to church. They weren't even sent to Sunday school, which is why it's a great encouragement to see all the children at the front here. Your children have the best chance in life. They're not going to end up in somewhere like Thompson House. Our residents have just had no background whatsoever. So it's against that privilege that we work with them, and we try to share a simple gospel message with them. A while back, I was watching TV with a resident, just in the lounge, and it was a dramatisation of the life of Darwin. So what's in that for Christians? But we were watching it, and in one scene, it showed all the characters coming out of church. And the resident said to me, isn't it a shame that people don't bother with church anymore? I kind of looked at him twice because he wasn't gospel greedy. He was not knocking the doors of the church down to get in. But I ignored that, and I just said, yes, it is. And I explained why my faith and why my church life was important to me. And he said to me, it's okay, it's easy for you to be a Christian. And I said, no, it's not. It's not easy at all to be a Christian. He said, it is. I've watched you. You're a good person. It's easy for you to be a Christian. Now, if anybody says that to you, it is not a compliment. It scared the living daylights out of me. Because I suddenly realized he doesn't read his Bible. He knows nothing about church. If he knows anything about Christianity, it's what he sees in my life. So that has really frightened me and made me realize how I have to live my life around the residents. But we got talking and I said, look, people in church are no different than you. All we are is sinners saved by grace. And I read Romans 3:23 to him, where it says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. And we talked about that. And I said, you could be a sinner saved by grace. He said, no, I can't. He said, I am a bad person. He said, I committed a crime. A person suffered because of me. My family suffered. They got their windows smashed. And I've been to prison. I am not a good person. I couldn't be a Christian. So we looked at 1 John 1:8-9, and it says there, if we claim to be without sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and cover all and purify us from all unrighteousness. And we discussed that, and he just said, no, he said, I'm too bad to be a Christian. But at least I got the opportunity, and we take all of those opportunities in Thompson House, whether it's over a TV program or whether it's over a game of snooker or cooking with them. We will use every opportunity. No resident will leave Thompson House without hearing a simple gospel message. Now, the same resident periodically drank and suffered from depression. One night, a few nights after that, he went and he got drunk, came back and said, I want to commit suicide. I'm going to take all my tablets. Different member of staff was on duty, sat with him, prayed with him, and read Psalm 51, which is entitled The Psalm of Forgiveness. And they discussed that and talked about it. The resident went to bed. They all have Gideon's Bibles in the room. He picked his Gideon's Bible up, reread Psalm 51. He went to bed and had a quiet, peaceful night. So those are just the opportunities we take. And as I say, we do use every opportunity like that. In the last few years, we have now been able to have, we started off with Christianity Explored, but we found that our residents couldn't understand that. It was too complicated. So we moved down to Life Explored, and we used that with them, and the residents responded more to that. So we did the first one in 2013, and I was speaking in Ballygolly Presbyterian. I think I pronounced that wrong, Ballygolly, down near Oma. And it was in a PW, and we were, I was talking to them about the work, and I explained, we're having our first Christianity Explored course. Would they please pray for it? I had very little faith. I'm thinking hopefully 3 or 4 will go along. So they prayed for me, prayed with me. At the end of the talk, I picked up my mobile phone and said, well, how many came? And 11 attended that night. It was just a real answer to prayer. And that really encouraged us. So we've carried on with that. It normally settles down to about 6. 6 of them come. But they listen. And if you've got 6, it's a good group. And they feel they can ask more questions. So that's a great encouragement. The one night that they really listen and the one night they get is when the subject of sin is covered. They don't try to pretend that they're not sinners. They don't try to downplay it. They know that we know their offences. They own up to that and they listen to it. We have worked with Prison Fellowship, and they also do Bible studies, Joshua Tree. And that's about restorative justice. So it's trying to get people to understand that they have committed crimes and that they can repent and they can become Christians. I think it's using Zacchaeus. So we did one of those in Thompson House, and it's a Christian course. 6 residents went to it, and one of them was a lifer. So he'd been convicted of murder when he was 18 years old, and he was now in his 40s. So he went along to this, and as part of the course, they bring a victim of crime. And the victim of crime that night was a family whose son had been murdered. And they tell their story. And how painful it is for them and how they have struggled and just how life has changed for them. But they do it from a Christian perspective with forgiveness and love and compassion. The resident was in tears at the end of it, and he went and he spoke to them and they prayed with him. And it was just fantastic. So we will use whatever we can to get a gospel message across, to let the residents know that God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten son, that whosoever believes in him can have everlasting life, and that they are the whosoever. Our residents quite often feel rejected by society. They expect to be judged by Christians. And when they come to Thompson House and they're not, they are really open to it. So they will come to Bible studies and they will listen to us. So it's really encouraging that the Presbyterian Church in Ireland is involved in this and wants to be involved in it. And I particularly want to thank you as a congregation that you support the United Appeal. That funding comes to the Council of Social Witness. They have been very, very generous over the years. Thompson House, certainly when I first started, got more money than a lot of projects. We now have to share the money around. There is less money to go around, but thank you for supporting the work. Our residents would not just walk into church. They would feel intimidated, especially a church this size. It would frighten the living daylights out of them. So the fact that we can at least get alongside them, pray with them, hopefully lead them to Christ, and then try to get them connected with the church is invaluable. And we do get a number of residents who will ask, could I have a minister? And I have a pool of ministers who will come and pray with them and minister to them as well. So we're getting all those opportunities, and thank you for support United Appeal and doing that. I also know that missionaries are very grateful to you because they need the money, they need the support. So although we're in a wee small corner of the world, and although you're one of the bigger congregations, you have an impact all over the world. People are being reached for Christ because you support the work in the United Appeal. It is not a pool of money that's just being sent to assembly buildings. It is being used for the furtherance of the gospel. So thank you very much for doing that. Very encouraged to hear about the prayer that you're going to go through. Please continue to pray. And please do pray for Thompson House at the moment. Your prayer works. I can tell you that. I know when I've spoken to missionaries, they will tell you quite often they struggle in the summer, and that can be because house groups aren't meeting, prayer groups aren't meeting. But the rest of the year is easier for them. Certainly in our situation, I had a deputy who wasn't Presbyterian. She was a Christian, and she said to me, have you noticed how the work in Thompson House is a whole lot easier in the middle of the month? And I said, yes, it is. I know, I wonder why that is. A few hours later, I suddenly said, we're in points for prayer in the middle of the month. That's why it's easier. So your prayer does work. So please get involved in this prayer this week and continually pray for the work. And thank you just for your support. It really is appreciated, and it's valuable, and it is needed. So thank you very much.